Next speaker is Derek Huffman, who some of you may know as Principal Teacher of Pedagogy at Berwickshire High School. And Berwickshire High School is where our keynote speaker, Bruce Robertson, is head teacher from last year. So I think he has one of the best jobs in the world, actually, as PT Pedagogy. It just sounds like an amazing role. And we're really looking forward to hearing his presentation about what remote learning has taught us about being a better teacher and how we can learn from that experience. So hopefully, if technology works, we are going to hear from Derek.
Hello, I'm Derek. I'm the PT of Pedagogy and an English teacher at the Berwickshire High School. Thanks very much to Darren and Fiona for inviting me to share some thoughts today. Lockdown learning. Remember that? Wasn't that a blast? On paper, it seemed great. Sleep in a bit, maybe go live on Teams for a few minutes, set them off to do a task, get a coffee, a muffin, another coffee, sit in the garden for a bit. Fantastic. The reality was anything but fantastic. By the way, I'm henceforth referring to these times as the time before, as I can't bring myself to utter the words isolation or lockdown any more than is absolutely necessary. It was unbelievably frustrating at times, but the biggest thing this experience kept giving me time and time again was a thirst for getting back into the classroom. It was kind of like, and I'm not sure if this will make sense to you, when you have a cold and you wonder how you could have ever taken clear sinuses for granted. You're almost angry at yourself, and you promise that you'll remember this discomfort if you ever pull through and get healthy again. In the same way, I promised myself, when I get back into the classroom, I'm going to own it. I'm not going to forget how lucky I am. I'm going to remember all those times I asked a question and got dead air as a response. I'm going to remember all those times that I wasn't sure if anyone was listening, despite my incredibly entertaining delivery. I'm going to remember all those times I wrote huge amounts of feedback only to discover the student looked at the grade and closed the file. I'm going to remember all those times that despite using amazing websites like Mentimeter to get live feedback and answers from students, half of them couldn't access it because they forgot one of 15 current passwords. I'm going to remember giving very explicit and what I thought to be extremely clear instructions, only to find that an embarrassingly large number of them didn't have a clue what to do. If a student isn't getting useful feedback, i.e. feedback that actually helps them improve, if a student isn't being encouraged to be switched on and engaged through constant low-stakes assessment, how can I expect them to know what's going on? If not everyone is answering, how do I know who knows, or more importantly, doesn't know what I want them to learn? I've learned not to take anything as a given. All those times I asked a blank screen a question, praying that at least one of the 25 students that I hoped were paying attention might answer. When I heard a microphone being unmuted, I'd feel a huge sense of relief. Yes, someone is paying attention. I couldn't wait to get back in the classroom to be able to properly check in on students, on all students. I was annoyed at myself for not taking full advantage of being face-to-face with students, to be able to properly communicate instead of just municate. All of this made me so excited to get back into the classroom. However, like that cold that goes away, it's easy to forget the hard times and to slip right back into the way it's I been. Scottish accent. So I'm going to keep reminding myself about the promises I made to myself. When I'm back, I am going to, as Mr. Sherrington reminds us, check, check, check. Through constant low-stakes assessment, I'm going to be constantly checking what's going on inside students' heads. I know that most of us are aware of show me boards, but they genuinely revolutionized my teaching. It was so obvious. I should be focused less on finding out who does know the answer and being relieved when the same go-to student puts their hand up, and focused more on who doesn't know the answer. I can learn more in 30 seconds about where a class is than in an hour of marking their jotters tonight. What's important is how I respond to the formative information I'm gleaning. Sometimes a quick comment correcting specific wrong answers will suffice. Other times, I need to jot down that student's name as a reminder to have a chat after class. This follow-up is clearly more important than the gathering of formative information, because otherwise, what am I doing? A show me board is just a piece of plastic unless it helps a student progress. I couldn't do this very well in the time before. Another thing I promised myself is that I was going to never let anyone off the hook. I absolutely loved being in the same class as my friend Dave. Dave was a bit of a know-it-all, but that didn't bother me. When we were in class, I could relax. Whenever Mrs. Kerr asked a question, Dave's hand would shoot up, and the teacher, clearly relieved that someone would bail her out, would always call on him. I don't remember ever learning anything in that class other than that I could fake it by trying to cram everything into my head before an assessment, forgetting it that afternoon. I'm certain that I was even able to catch up on some missed sleep in that class thanks to Dave. Throughout my teaching career, I've come across many Daves, and I'm ashamed to say I've more than occasionally fallen into the same trap as Mrs. Kerr. All this experience in the time before, where a screen of blank avatars stared back at me, reminded me that to help with engagement, to help students think hard about something, to force them to engage in retrieval practice and the constant low-stakes assessment mentioned earlier, I needed to keep them on their toes at all times. Not in the state of intense fear that I see some teachers creating, but in a state of readiness, without fear of getting it wrong, so long as they really tried. At the risk of sounding patronizing, a list of the most effective ways of inducing this state for me include show me boards, cold calling, pose, pounce, bounce, add to that, and think, pair, share. Yet another promise I made myself is to give useful feedback, i.e. feedback that is used. Well, this is a no-brainer, right? That's what we do. When we aren't marking, we're often found talking about how much marking we're doing. However, unfortunately, lots of marking and useful feedback are not synonymous. I started teaching many moons ago in a generation of teachers who seemed to measure their quality as a teacher by the quantity of stuff that was marked, although never explicitly said, if you weren't carrying 3 stones of jotters home on a Friday, you weren't pulling your weight. How many hours, days, weeks, months of my life have been wasted writing things that have had no impact on student learning? If, as John Hattie reminds us, teachers are evaluators of impact, shouldn't I have noticed the skewed cost-benefit ratio of all that writing in jotters, on assessments, on dissertations? The time before, with its lack of following through, brought this to the fore and reminded me that for feedback to be useful, it needs to fulfill certain criteria. Everyone needs to get it, frequently. It needs to be as specific as I can possibly make it. I need to make sure students understand it and can do something with it. For real progress to happen, I need to make them work harder with it than I did creating it. I need to check that they have done something with it. Yikes. Seems like a lot of work. Almost like more work than I do now. Aren't these things supposed to help reduce my workload? I'd argue that it's not more work, it's different work. and work that can be done efficiently. The constant low-stakes assessment we discussed earlier is a great way to learn a lot about your students and to give meaningful, specific, frequent feedback. Making students work with it and checking that, maybe that's adding something. But if we dismiss it for that reason, I'd argue we aren't seeing the forest for the trees. All too often in this job, we find ourselves doing things because we're told to, without thinking about why we're doing them. I'd argue that the time taken to address this step is the most important thing we do. In the time before, I would be thinking more about giving students stuff to do and much less about what happens afterwards. Embarrassingly, I must admit to occasionally finding myself in the same situation now that we're back. My cold is gone, and I'm so glad to be feeling better that I fell back into old ways. Without making sure students are doing something with their feedback, I might as well not give any feedback. I'm going to take the time to give specific next steps and the opportunity to take those steps. Okay. There were a few things we were able to learn from the time before, from the lessons that worked well. The time before occasionally gave us a useful reminder of the importance of the basics. Where remote lessons were engaging students, they weren't doing anything different because good remote teaching was just good teaching. These lessons started with a daily review wherein they usually promoted retrieval practice of content from yesterday's, last week's, last topic's lessons. This forced students to think hard about the information. They discussed the very clear learning intentions and set out the success criteria like a checklist, making it easily achievable for all students. This takes the guesswork away from students. There were fewer they can what to do's. Teachers then modeled what they wanted students to do, gave time for students to work independently. Then they usually finished with a plenary review, wherein they revisited the learning intention and checked whether students learned what they wanted them to learn. It's useful in these daily and plenary reviews and throughout the lesson to keep in mind that you're trying to find out which students don't know rather than who does. So making their thinking visible is important. This may be all well and good for secondary school, and you may think that a rigid structure like that won't work in a primary school, and maybe you're right. But since novices in a subject area learn better using these principles, and since this applies to novices of all ages, I suggest that if you were to remember the ideas behind these things, if you were to attempt to follow these principles, because that's what they are, guiding principles, you'll see an increase in engagement, student confidence, and knowledge. Since we've been back, where I've seen teachers refocus their practice on these basic elements, behavior has improved too, because fewer students are off task because they don't get it. These are all the things in BHS's lesson evaluation toolkit, which we use to promote discussion with ourselves and colleagues. They are heavily aligned with Rosenshine's principles of instruction, and although we're not trying to prescribe what every lesson should look like, together, they do lead to better engagement and learning. Quite simply, they work. The time before reminded us of what we should have known and remembered already. More often than not, though, like being full of the cold, the whole experience was incredibly frustrating. The time before is hopefully a permanent thing of the past, but I'd love to try and pull some sort of positives out of it. I was reminded that by constantly checking, I can get a clearer picture of who knows and doesn't know what they should, and I can act on that. By not letting anyone off the hook, I can encourage constant engagement. By making sure feedback is specific and acted upon, I can help students progress and achieve. By focusing on the basics set out in our toolkit, daily review, discussing learning intentions and success criteria, modeling, independent work, plenary to check who has and hasn't learned something, and promoting retrieval practice in my lessons, I can help students learn better. So I have to begrudgingly say a big thank you to, and I'm going to say it, lockdown, for everything you've done for us, which is almost nothing really. But you did remind me of the amazing opportunity I have in the classroom to make a real difference. When we get bogged down by paperwork or having to sit through health and safety presentations, we start moaning about how much we have to do and how little time we have, and that there aren't enough resources to do this or that. Let's not forget how lucky we are to be here and that we have the best job in the world.
Love that message. The best job in the world.
We absolutely do. We have the best job in the world, and we're so privileged to be able to have that impact. And a lot of what Derek was saying there, I think, comes back to so many of the quotes that we've had about doing less but doing it better, like keeping it simple but focusing on checking for understanding, making sure our pupils are thinking, using the show me boards. Yeah, so much gold in there. I love that. I tweeted that I think every school needs a PT pedagogy as passionate and as humorous as Derek Huffman. He was great, and I know that there's quite a lot on the chats there. I'm just going to pull out some comments. You've probably seen them already. One of our later speakers today, Tamina Begum, is saying that she loves this. She feels seen. Really good reminder about the impact of what we're doing rather than just doing stuff. And I think we can sometimes all be guilty of just getting into the habit of just doing stuff without thinking about does it really have an impact? And again, coming back to Billy, does it make the ship go faster? Does it have a difference to our young people in their learning? We're really, really lucky to have had that input from Derek.
Definitely, thank you. And as you said, so much gold in there. Breaking teaching down into those elements like they've done at Berwickshire High School is simply incredible. If you haven't done so, please connect with @TT Delusion. Bruce Robertson, who is our keynote speaker, has got 2 new books out, really breaking down what they do and really helping us figure out what works and what doesn't. And as Derek said, they do this simply because it increases engagement and it works. And that'll be exemplified. Sadly, Derek isn't on social media, but you can find the work he does on the Berwickshire High School website. If you find the tab for the pedagogy channel, you can see some work that he's done.